Today, there are fewer than 10 Kmart stores remaining in the entire world. But for a generation of Americans, the disappearance of the Big Red K didn't feel like a corporate bankruptcy. It felt like the erasure of a childhood ritual. Even now, if you close your eyes, you can probably still feel the specific rattling vibration of a Kmart shopping cart as the wheels hit the seams in the cracked linoleum floor. You can hear the low-frequency hum of the massive industrial lighting and the distant tinny sound of easy listening music playing through speakers that hadn't been dusted since the Nixon administration. Kmart wasn't just a store. It was a sprawling concrete sanctuary where the American middle class was forged. It was the scenery of our lives. It was the place where your parents bought the garden hoses that smelled like summer, the polyester slacks that got you through church every Sunday, and the cheap warm cafeteria popcorn that was the undisputed highlight of your week. To understand why Kmart's death matters so much, we have to go back to a version of America that no longer exists. A version where the Saturday morning trip was a sacred duty, and where a rotating blue light could turn a group of total strangers into a competitive team of bargain hunters. We are going to explore how a man named Sebastian Spearing Kresge built a five-and-dime empire on the streets of Detroit, how it exploded into a global superpower that Sam Walton lived in fear of, and how it was eventually harvested for its real estate by the very people who were supposed to save it. The story of Kmart doesn't begin in a massive suburban parking lot. It begins in 1899 in the smoky industrial heart of Detroit, Michigan. Sebastian Spearing Kresge was a man who understood a fundamental truth about the American worker. You don't build a fortune by selling one expensive thing to a few people. You build it by selling a billion tiny things to everyone. Kresge was a traditionalist, a man who lived through the era of the general store and saw the birth of the modern city. He opened his first five-and-dime store with a simple promise: a nickel's worth of thread, a dime's worth of candy, and a level of reliability that the neighborhood could set its watch by. For 60 years, Kresge was the bedrock of the American Main Street. These weren't destination stores. They were fixtures of daily life. You went to Kresge's for your sewing needles, your stationery, and your seasonal decorations. It was cozy, it was wooden floored, and it smelled like peppermint and floor wax. By the 1920s, Kresge had hundreds of locations across the East and Midwest. They survived the Great Depression because their prices were already at the floor. In a world of economic ruin, the five-and-dime was the one place where you could still feel like a consumer. But by the late 1950s, the American landscape was experiencing a seismic shift. The GI Bill, the explosion of the automobile, and the brand new interstate highway system were dragging the American family away from the cramped, vertical downtowns. They were moving to the horizontal world of the suburbs. The five-and-dime model, with its narrow aisles and lack of parking, was suddenly a relic. A man named Harry Cunningham, a vice president at Kresge, saw the end coming. He didn't just see a changing market, he saw a changing psychology. The new suburban mother didn't want to carry bags down a city street. She wanted to drive a station wagon to a massive, brightly lit oasis where she could buy everything from detergent to auto tires in a single trip. Cunningham made the most audacious bet in retail history. He convinced the Kresge board to pivot the entire billion-dollar, century-old company toward a radical new concept: the big box discount department store. He didn't want to just build a bigger Kresge. He wanted to build a machine for the middle class. He called it Kmart, and in 1962, the world of retail experienced what historians call the Big Bang. It is one of the most incredible coincidences in industrial history. In a single 12-month window, the four titans of the modern shopping era all launched their first stores. Walmart opened in Rogers, Arkansas. Target appeared in Roseville, Minnesota. Kohl's opened in Wisconsin, and Kmart opened its doors in Garden City, Michigan. But here is the detail that people forget. In 1962, Kmart was the one that looked like the winner. While Sam Walton was a struggling entrepreneur in a rural backwater with a single store that leaked whenever it rained, Kmart launched with the full might and capital of the Kresge empire behind it. They didn't just open a store, they opened a revolution. In that first year alone, Kmart launched 18 massive locations. They had the supply chains, they had the brand awareness, and most importantly, they had the premium real estate. By 1966, just 4 years after launch, Kmart was generating $1 billion in sales. To put that in perspective, it was the fastest corporate expansion in the history of the world up to that point. They were opening a new store every week. They were the dominant force in the suburban landscape, the anchor of every new strip mall that was rising from the cornfields of Ohio and the suburbs of New Jersey. Kmart mastered the one-stop shop. They were the first to realize that the suburban housewife was the busiest person in America. They designed the stores to be overwhelming but efficient. They bought their own brands, the legendary K-Grow garden supplies and the Toughskins apparel. They were the benchmark. Throughout the late 60s and early 70s, Kmart was the undisputed king of the hill. They were the gold standard that every competitor studied with the obsessive focus. This included Sam Walton. In his autobiography, Walton famously admitted that he spent more time walking the aisles of Kmart than he did his own stores. He would go into a Kmart at night, literalizing the industrial spy role, measuring the height of their shelves, taking notes on their lighting fixtures, and counting the number of cars in the parking lot. He was the student, and Kmart was the master. Kmart had won the first round by a landslide. They had the best locations, the biggest footprint, and the most iconic marketing in the country. But in the seeds of this early dominance, the rot was already beginning to set in. Because while Kmart was focusing on the marketing, the blue light, the celebrity endorsements, and the giant banners, the student in Arkansas was focusing on something far less glamorous. He was focusing on the logistics. He was focusing on the back of the house, while Kmart was only looking at the front. Hit that subscribe button and tell us in the comments, what was your town's Kmart like? Was it the centerpiece of the local mall, or was it a standalone monument? We're going to dive into the golden age and the psychological masterpiece of the blue light special in the next chapter. By 1970, the Kmart experience had become a sensory staple of the American weekend. It was the third space for the suburban family, that unique place between home and work where life actually happened. The architecture of a 1970s Kmart was designed for efficiency, but it felt like a carnival. The stores were huge, brightly lit, and intentionally overwhelming. You entered through the automatic sliding doors, a high-tech novelty at the time, and were immediately hit by the scent of the Kmart deli. It was a smell that every person over 50 can still recall with perfect clarity. It was a specific heavy blend of red-dyed popcorn, giant soft pretzels warming under orange heat bulbs, and sub-sandwiches wrapped in cellophane that had been sitting in the refrigerator case since 6 a.m. For a child in 1975, the Kmart deli was the peak of culinary luxury. It was the bribe your parents used to get you through the hour-long trip through the clothing racks and the household cleaners. The sight of that red popcorn machine, the kernels tumbling over like a salty avalanche, was the signal that the shopping trip was almost over. Kmart's brilliance in this era was its total market saturation. They didn't just build in the safe, wealthy neighborhoods. They built everywhere. They were the first major retailer to prove that discount didn't have to mean cheap. They carried name brands, Levi's, Wrangler, General Electric, but they sold them for 5 or 10% less than the local department store. They were the great levelers of the American economy. This was the era of the Kmart family. The company understood that if they could get the mother in for the cleaning supplies, the father for the fishing tackle, and the kids for the toys, usually their own K-Grow brand, they owned the entire household's budget. It was a cradle-to-grave strategy. You bought your first pair of infant sneakers at Kmart, and decades later, you bought your first set of house paints and your retirement fishing gear there. But in 1965, Kmart introduced the psychological masterpiece that would define their brand for 40 years, the Blue Light Special. It was simple, it was crude, and it was brilliant. You'd be shopping in the quiet hum of the afternoon, perhaps in the pharmacy or the housewares department, when suddenly a sharp crackle would erupt from the overhead speakers. The voice was usually tired, the sound of an assistant manager who had been on their feet for 10 hours. But the words they spoke were electric. Attention Kmart shoppers, we have a blue light special in the sporting goods department. For the next 15 minutes only, you can get a 3-pack of tennis balls for just $1.99. Follow the rotating blue light for massive savings. And then it would happen. A literal police-style rotating blue light on a tall chrome pole would start spinning in a corner of the store. Total strangers would suddenly pivot their carts, racing toward the flash like moths to a flame. It was the original flash sale, a psychological trigger that turned a boring afternoon of buying detergent into a high-stakes scavenger hunt. For 40 years, Kmart wasn't just a store. It was the bedrock of the American middle class. It was where you bought your first bike, where you picked up your prescriptions, and where you met your neighbors. In its prime, Kmart was so dominant that the idea of it vanishing was as unthinkable as the sun not rising. It was the king of the hill. The toy department in a 1970s Kmart was a place of high drama. This was long before the specialized toy stores, like Toys R Us, had taken over completely. In the weeks leading up to Christmas, the Kmart toy aisles were the front line of the American childhood dream. They had the bins of plastic dinosaurs, the rows of generic but durable board games, and the K-Grow bicycles that were slightly heavier than the brand name versions, but lasted 3 times as long in the summer sun. You remember the sound of the metal shelves and the sight of the giant holiday banners hanging from the ceiling. And then there was the Kmart cafeteria ritual. It wasn't just about the food, it was about the break. In an era before every corner had a Starbucks or a fast food joint, the Kmart cafeteria was the community hub. You'd see retirees sitting there for hours over a single cup of coffee, and young mothers sharing a basket of fries with their toddlers. It was a space that didn't demand anything from you other than your presence. It was the living room of the neighborhood. In 1973, Kmart was so dominant that they surpassed the 100-year-old SS Kresge entirely, officially renaming the parent company Kmart Corporation. They were the second largest retailer in the world, trailing only Sears. But while Sears was the destination for the hard lines, the Kenmore fridges and the Craftsman tools, Kmart was the undisputed king of the soft lines. They defined what the American middle class looked like, literally. If Kmart put a specific style of plaid shirt or polyester slacks in their Sunday flyer, that style became the uniform of the American heartland overnight. They had achieved total cultural dominance. They had the location, the marketing, and the sensory connection to the consumer. But as they looked out over their empire in 1980, they missed the one thing that was growing in the shadows. They missed the fact that while they were focusing on the experience of the store, their competitors were focusing on the science of the sale. If this is bringing back memories of your Saturday mornings at the Kmart deli, tell us, what was your go-to snack? Was it the popcorn, the giant pretzels, or the cellophane-wrapped subs? Hit that subscribe button as we move into the era of the Great Distraction and the logistics war. At the very peak of their power, the executives in Detroit made a series of catastrophic strategic errors. Flush with cash from their thousands of stores, they became distracted. They looked at their mountain of profit and decided that being the world's greatest discount retailer wasn't enough. They wanted to be a conglomerate. Throughout the late 80s and early 90s, Kmart went on a feverish spree of acquisitions. They weren't just buying other stores. They were trying to buy the entire suburban shopping center. They bought Borders Books. They bought Office Max. They bought Sports Authority. They even bought a pharmacy chain and a home improvement chain called Builders Square. On paper, this was a masterclass in diversification. It was known as the category killer strategy. The goal was for Kmart to own every stage of a consumer's life. If you wanted a book, you went to Kmart's company. If you wanted an office chair, you went to Kmart's company. But in reality, this diversification was a slow-acting poison. Because Kmart was spending billions to manage bookstores and sporting goods warehouses, they stopped investing in their own stores. The original Kmart locations, the engines that provided all the cash, began to visibly age. The roofs started to leak, and instead of fixing them, managers were told to place plastic buckets in the aisles. The white linoleum floors, once the pride of the suburbs, began to yellow and peel at the edges. The bright, welcoming lighting of the 1960s was replaced by harsh, flickering tubes that made the merchandise look sad and old. Kmart was starving its own heart to feed its limbs. More importantly, Kmart made the same fatal mistake that Sears would eventually make. They ignored the digital revolution that was beginning to brew in the rural heartland. While Kmart was busy managing book inventories and sports gear, Sam Walton was doing something boring. He was investing every single penny of profit into a radical new technology, the Universal Product Code or the barcode. In the early 1980s, Kmart's inventory system was still stuck in the 1950s. If a store ran out of a specific brand of detergent, a manager had to walk the aisle with a clipboard, count the empty pegs, and physically call a warehouse to order more. It was slow, it was expensive, and it was prone to human error. Walmart, however, was building a digital nervous system. Every time a barcode was scanned at a Walmart register, the information was flashed to a central computer in Bentonville. The system knew exactly what was sold, in what color, and in what town, in real time. The replacement truck was dispatched before the shelf was even empty. Kmart leadership notoriously dismissed the barcode as a technical gimmick. They believed that their brand was so iconic, that the blue light was so powerful, that the boring plumbing of the business didn't matter. They were wrong. By 1985, the efficiency gap between Walmart and Kmart was becoming a canyon. Walmart's costs were lower, their shelves were fuller, and their prices were starting to undercut Kmart by 5, 10, and eventually 15%. The king was still on the throne, but the walls of the castle were starting to crumble from the inside out. Kmart's response to this threat was a masterclass in corporate panic. Instead of fixing their distribution systems or cleaning their decaying stores, they decided they needed to change their image. They were embarrassed by being a discount store. They wanted to be the fashionable discounter. This was the dawn of the Martha Stewart everyday era. In 1987, Kmart signed a massive, exclusive deal with Martha Stewart, the undisputed queen of American domestic perfection. It was a stroke of marketing brilliance, but a stroke of strategic desperation. Suddenly, the aisles of Kmart were filled with premium-looking linens, high thread count sheets, and kitchenware in Martha's specific curated color palettes. For a few years, the mirage worked. High-income shoppers who wouldn't be caught dead in a Kmart were suddenly walking those yellowed floors, looking for a specific shade of seafoam green towels. But the Martha Stewart era was ultimately just a designer band-aid on a massive, gaping gunshot wound. While the Martha sections of the store looked like a boutique in the Hamptons, the rest of the building was literally falling apart. You would walk through a beautiful display of designer curtains and then have to step over a plastic bucket catching water from a leaky roof. The experience of Kmart became one of profound cognitive dissonance. You were buying a dream of perfection in a building that was showing every sign of a nightmare. As the 90s progressed, Kmart found itself caught in a deadly vice. At the bottom, Walmart was the lower price, the undisputed king of the budget. At the top, Target was rising with its Target aesthetic, offering a cleaner, cooler, slightly more upscale version of the discount dream. Kmart was stuck in the muddled middle. They weren't cheap enough to beat Sam Walton, and they weren't cool enough to beat the planners at Target. They were a company without a mission, a brand without a home. The final desperate gasps came in the late 90s with an initiative called Blue Light Always. In a move that would be studied in business schools for decades as a failure of basic math, Kmart lowered prices on thousands of items to match Walmart. But they still didn't have the technology or the supply chain to support it. They were losing money on every transaction, hemorrhaging billions of dollars in a single year while their competitors were booming. They were subsidizing their own destruction. Tell us in the comments, did your local Kmart ever get the Martha Stewart makeover? Or did it stay stuck in the 1970s until the end? Hit that subscribe button as we move into the final controlled demolition of the brand. In January 2002, the unthinkable finally happened. Kmart, the titan that had defined the retail landscape for 40 years, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. At the time, it was the largest retail failure in American history. Over 280 stores were shuttered instantly, leaving gaping, empty holes in strip malls from coast to coast. For the American consumer, it felt like a death in the family. The blue light had officially gone out. But as we saw in the story of Sears, the bankruptcy wasn't the end. It was just the opening act for a much darker, much more calculated final chapter. Because standing in the wings, watching the remains of the empire with the eyes of a wolf, was a man named Eddie Lampert. He didn't come to save the blue light, he came to harvest the real estate. When Kmart emerged from its first bankruptcy in 2003, the world expected a turnaround. They expected a reinvention. But what they got was something far more clinical. The company was no longer a retail business that happened to own real estate. Under the control of hedge fund manager Eddie Lampert, it became a real estate portfolio that happened to have some retail stores attached to it. Lampert was often hailed as the next Warren Buffett, but his strategy with Kmart was the polar opposite of Buffett's long-term stewardship. Lampert saw that while the retail business was dying, the soil underneath the stores, the thousands of acres of suburban real estate, was worth billions. He didn't want to fix the leaky roofs or the yellowed floors. He wanted to harvest them. In 2004, Lampert pulled off one of the most audacious and ultimately most destructive moves in corporate history. He used the cash reserves of the newly leaner Kmart to buy Sears Roebuck. It was a merger of two industrial ghosts. On paper, the new Sears Holdings was a retail behemoth with over 3,000 locations. But in reality, it was two sinking ships tied together, hoping that by doubling the weight, they might somehow find a way to float. The Lampert era was defined by a policy that historians and retail analysts now call benign neglect, but it was anything but benign. Lampert believed that the rise of the internet and the shifting consumer patterns meant that physical stores were essentially dead men walking. So instead of trying to save the patient, he decided to perform a slow, profitable autopsy. He refused to spend a single dollar on basic maintenance. He notoriously slashed the capital expenditure budget, the money used to fix leaky roofs, update checkout systems, paint walls, and even maintain the parking lots, to a fraction of what Walmart and Target were spending. While Walmart was investing billions in cleaner aisles and better lighting, Kmart was literally crumbling. The most controversial move was the creation of Seritage Growth Properties. Lampert took Kmart's most valuable real estate, the ground underneath the best-performing stores, and sold it to a separate company that he also controlled. He then made Kmart and Sears pay market-rate rent back to Seritage for the buildings they used to own. It was a brilliant move for the investors, as it turned a liable retail brand into a stable real estate income stream. But for the retail workers, it was a death sentence. It added a massive new expense to stores that were already struggling to stay profitable. It was the ultimate inside job of the retail world. If you walked into a Kmart in the 2000s, the experience was haunting. It was like walking into a time capsule that had been left to rot. The shelves were half empty, the aisles were silent, and the staff had been cut to a skeleton crew. You would see "coming soon" signs that never arrived, and final clearance signs that stayed up for years. The blue light wasn't just gone. It had been replaced by a sense of profound, quiet desperation. It was a store that was clearly, visibly being allowed to die. While the stores crumbled, Lampert was busy unlocking value by selling off Kmart's crown jewels one by one. This wasn't just about brands. It was about the heritage of the American home. He sold the Craftsman brand to Stanley Black & Decker, a move that felt like an amputation to those who had grown up with Kmart tools. He sold the Kenmore and Die Hard brands, effectively stripping the company of the quality associations that had taken a century to build. By 2018, the controlled demolition was complete. Sears Holdings filed for bankruptcy again, but this time there was no Martha Stewart to save them. There was no big bang of suburban growth. There was only the liquidation of the remains. The liquidation firms arrived like vultures, stripping the metal from the shelves and the copper from the walls. Today, there are fewer than 10 Kmart stores left in the entire world. In most towns, the Big Red K has been taken down, and the buildings have been converted into U-Haul storage centers, indoor pickleball courts, or just left as empty, gray monuments to an era that is never coming back. The tragedy of Kmart isn't just that it failed to compete with a better machine. The tragedy is that Kmart represented a specific promise to the American people. It was the equality of the aisle. It was the idea that you could have a good life, a clean home, and a happy holiday without being wealthy. Whether you were a factory worker or a town doctor, you both shopped for the same light bulbs and the same socks under the same fluorescent lights. It was a shared experience that bonded the American suburb together. When the blue light went out, we lost more than a place to buy cheap towels. We lost a third space. We lost the weekend ritual. We traded the messy human experience of the Kmart deli, the smell of the popcorn, and the sound of the neighbors talking, for the cold, algorithmic efficiency of an Amazon package arriving on a doorstep. We gained convenience, certainly. We gained speed and bottom-of-the-barrel prices. But as we look at the empty gray hulks of the old Kmart buildings that still sit at the edge of our towns, we've had to wonder, what exactly did we lose in the transaction? We lost a piece of our collective identity. We lost the confidence that an American brand could stay great forever simply by serving its neighbors well. Kmart didn't die because the world changed. It died because the leaders in the glass towers forgot that a store isn't just a collection of assets to be moved like chess pieces on a board. A store is a contract. It's a promise of quality, a promise of presence, and a promise of community. And when you stop caring about the light bulbs in the aisles and the people under the roof, the entire structure eventually falls in on itself. The rotating blue light is gone. The popcorn machines are cold. The automatic doors remain shut. But for those of us who grew up in the K era, the memory of that Saturday morning ritual remains a ghost of a simpler, more connected America. An America that knew exactly what to do when they heard the words, "Attention Kmart shoppers. Attention Kmart shoppers. The doors are closing for the last time." If this documentary brought back memories of your Saturday mornings at Kmart, please hit that subscribe button. We're telling the stories of the places that built America, one aisle at a time. It's your support that allows us to keep exploring the ghosts of our industrial past. Tell us your best Kmart memory in the comments below. We'll see you in the next one.